My name's Olivier Krischer. For those who don't know me, I'm Acting Director at the University of Sydney China Studies Centre. It's great to see everyone here, and I'd like to formally welcome you to this online discussion today about the economic impacts of the coronavirus, COVID-19, on the bilateral relationship on China and Australian business. We're joined by a fantastic panel. Before I get into that, I'd like to, as is customary, acknowledge the traditional owners, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land I am speaking from today, and on whose land the University of Sydney is built and runs and continues to do the work of education, of passing on knowledge and culture. I would like to briefly just say a word about each of our panelists, and then I'll hand over to our moderator today, who is Angus Grigg, who's joining us from the Australian Financial Review. He's also been based in China previously, so brings a wealth of experience. On our panel today, we are joined, very lucky to have with us Dr. Geoff Raby, who was Australia's ambassador to China from 2007 to 2011, but also had a 27-year public service career, after which he established Geoff Raby and Associates in 2011, and today serves on the board of a number of ASX-listed companies, including Yancoal and Ocean Gold. He is the co-chair of Cause Chambers Westcast China Practice. Also on the panel is Professor Hans Handrischke, who is the Professor of Chinese Business and Management at the University of Sydney's Business School. He leads the Business School's China Research Network and chairs the Business and Economics Research Cluster at our China Studies Centre. He has also had a long, varied career in China from 1979, working both as a diplomat and also in finance. Also joining us is Sarah Chang, who is the Head of International Business at Business Australia. Sarah has over 20 years of experience in international trade and business consultancy, both in China and Australia. And she's frequently asked to speak, such as today, and to write about this experience and how to do business between the two. She's the co-author of the book, Engaging China, The Realities for Australian Businesses. And last, but certainly not least, we're very privileged to have with us from Beijing this morning, very early morning, for him, Professor Jia Daozhong, who is Professor in the School of International Studies and at the Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development at Peking University in Beijing. His areas of expertise include international political economy and China's international economic relations, particularly in energy and natural resources, something we'll hear a little bit more about today, as well as developmental aid and the nexus between politics and economics. So with that introduction, I'm going to hand over now to the panel. The way things will work is we're going to have some panel discussion questions between the panelists, and then we'll open up to some of the questions that were sent in earlier and have a discussion through the chat at the end of this session. We're going to try and keep the time, so please, if you do have questions, try and make them specific, short and succinct, and directed to any one of the panelists. So thank you again for all those people still coming in. It's great to see this interest, and I'll hand over to you, Angus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivier. Yes, no, excellent panel we've got this morning, and so I thought we may as well just jump straight into it. I might just say, by way of an introduction, we've seen some very hawkish comments coming out of Europe and London over the last couple of weeks regarding China. In the UK, we've seen cabinet ministers there talk about a total reset and that everything's back on the table in terms of China. In Germany overnight, we had an MP saying that China had lost Europe over the last couple of weeks. Here in Australia, the rhetoric has not been so sharp, but we have equally come into some criticism from Beijing for the Foreign Minister Maurice Payne's call to have an independent inquiry into the origins of the COVID-19 virus. So I think that's a really a good way to frame the early discussion around what state the bilateral relationship is coming into or coming out of COVID-19. And so maybe I might just touch on that firstly and maybe throw to Professor Jia, as you've got up the earliest this morning, so you can get the first answer in. I wonder how you see the state of the bilateral relationship at present, and do you think that perhaps it might be an opportunity to reset coming out of COVID-19? I note that the Chinese Foreign Ministry in Beijing said earlier this that while it was quite critical of Australia calling for an independent inquiry, it also said that Australia should meet China halfway, which to me sort of suggested there was some room, some goodwill on the Chinese side, that maybe there could be something of a rapprochement. Professor Jutt, do you want to jump in straight away? Then we'll go around the panelists and get their view on where we're up to on the bilateral relationship.
All right, sure. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join the discussion. I will be doing a similar discussion with a group of Europeans later this afternoon. It's too sad that both coming out of China at this point of time and from the rest of the world, when China was first going through the what's now called COVID-19, it's too sad that either way there has not been much of an empathy, and that's horribly lacking. Many of us in this country thought this was going to be another SARS. It was not going to be really transmitted out of involving other societies, but now here we have. Now, how does that impact Australia-China relations? I don't really think there is much of any impact, because the relationship historically has been very asymmetrical at the level of political attention. Over there in Australia, you have a way higher level of attention to getting your relation with China right. On our side, probably of Australia, in some ways, does not feature that high on the I wouldn't call it a ladder, but on the priority list of political relationships. And unfortunately, the media it's not just here in China, but also in Australia, they get into this echo chamber effect of picking up some negativity towards each other. And that leaves the business community and those of us like educators to be struggling to get heard. But that all said, Australia's relationship with China, politically, it was, like I said, asymmetrical, but in terms of trade, economics has been very sound, and the free trade agreement worked very well. And Australia is one of the major OECD economies that China has a free trade arrangement, and it's been very fully implemented. And when we have a possible recovery, probably in the third quarter of this year, Australia as a reliable supplier and of high quality ore and other products, food, and it will be, I think the actual impact will be very minimal. At this point of time, the Chinese economy, if we think about recovery, it will have to depend on two developments. One is the external demand. For this point of time, probably for another quarter or so, medical supplies, masks, ventilators will be the main products China produces and ship abroad. But the end of this month, in a few days, we are going to have the National People's Congress. That's a sign of normalcy. That's about the time when leaders throughout the country will hammer out a deal for the rest of the year. So I would expect Chinese imports of Australian supplies to pick up rather rapidly in the fall, in the third quarter. So why don't I just leave it there and
sure. Geoff, you want to, Geoff, I might go to you. That was very diplomatic of you, Professor, but Geoff, I mean, how do you see the relationship coming into this? And is there any sense that we could use this to maybe move away from some of the sharper rhetoric we've seen?
Thanks very much, Angus. And of course, I don't have much of a reputation in diplomacy, so your introduction was very apt. Yeah, and I'll start off with that because, look, I've written over and over again now, and it goes for like the last 2 years, that our relationship with China is at the lowest ebb it's been since diplomatic relations were established in 1972. And that is a big issue. Now, In terms of the commercial dimension, through all the vicissitudes of the relationship, our exports have just grown and grown, but they're clearly very narrowly based. And,
Right.
you know, if you take iron ore out of the question, even more narrowly based. And I mentioned iron ore specifically. I mean, coal continues to grow. But I mentioned iron ore specifically because I think we may be in a period of sort of false consciousness, because much of the supply, global supply that would compete with us, comes from Brazil, from Vale, and that's been taken out of the equation because of their 2 tailings dam accidents. And that's still got to come back onto the market at some point. And I think there will be an appetite from Beijing to diversify supply away from Australia to other alternative sources. The other big one, of course, is the impact on students and tourists. And whilst we might get back to a more normal situation in the 3rd quarter of this year, I don't think travel restrictions are going to be lifted anytime soon, and it could even be into next year. So that's going to have a very big impact, because after iron ore, I think students are the biggest export to China. And so,
quickly, let me jump in there, Geoff. The chances of a sort of diplomatic reset out of this?
Yeah, just coming to that. So the trade relationship will remain strong, as it has been through the ups and downs of the relationship over the last several years. But I don't see at this stage, particularly with the positions taken by the Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, and Minister Dutton recently, as indicating any appetite on the Australian side to move towards improved relations that we've had over the last couple of years.
Hans, do you want to jump in there? I know you've got a particular view on Chinese students and things, but maybe the first, the bilateral relationship firstly, and then I'll come to you, Sarah.
Yes, I'd love to basically echo what the previous speakers have said, and I would take it one step further in saying that Australia and China, in fact, are economically mutually dependent. They can't do one without the other. China needs iron ore from Australia, needs other supply, even food, for recovery and for rebuilding its whole food industry, which is crucial as we see now with the wet markets and whatever. And Australia, on the other hand, needs exports. And I think what we don't really see as clearly yet, as we will fairly soon, is the pressure on government, on business, on tax revenue to raise revenue, because we will be facing this huge deficit. And to confine the debate to tax incentives or not, that doesn't produce really the money that is needed to overcome that. And the way we are going, I think, with the government actually is quite positive. The idea of reshoring Australian manufacturing capacities is something that could create workplaces, but I think we have to keep in mind this is not going to be a huge manufacturing industry. It will be only working in markets where we are competitive, and that's, as Andrew Livery said, it's largely around health, it's food, it's energy, it's infrastructure. And as it happens, the reason why we are competitive in those markets is because we're dealing with China, because we're basically built up capacities to supply the demand in China. So even if we move to a stronger manufacturing component in our industrial mix, we will still have to work with China. That is one part. And then, of course, part of that will be that we will have to reconsider Chinese investment again, not so much from the perspective of China is taking over Australian assets, but more from the perspective, how do we get Chinese participation and cooperation in tailoring products for the Chinese market and in extensions for the international market. So I think, and that's echoing what Professor Jha and what Geoff said, pressure on the Australian government to look after business and listen more to the business view in the future mix of policies is going to be quite crucial. And I think the problem we're facing really is a lack of connectivity. And I think you can pack all the problems that we have somehow under there. Connectivity, we have it in technical things. We have it in custom clearance. We have it in a whole lot of things where we're really good, but we don't have it in security areas. The whole Huawei debacle is in the end a technical issue, but we haven't solved that, and we don't really talk eye to eye with that. Likewise, with the point that Geoff made about the COVID question of whether we should send people to China or what we should do. In the end, it's an institutional question. It shouldn't be political. So it comes down to connectivity as well. And there we have to do a lot. And I think that's also one area where the students fit in. And I share the concern that Geoff raised, that students are crucial as an asset in our connectivity. But depending on where the virus goes in China, we might not be able to overcome the travel restrictions.
Okay, that might be a good point to jump into. Sarah, do you think we might see some pragmatism return with the need for tax revenue and export dollars from Canberra, that we might see a greater, I guess, pragmatism in terms of the bilateral relationship and maybe a louder voice from the business community?
I definitely see there's a huge need of bigger voice from the business community. I feel from medium long-term perspective, our bilateral relationship largely relies on three factors. The first is on actually I probably come with the first one. Depends on how we play with it rather than how China play with it. China is still building its position and strengthening its position, especially currently with the pressure of the trade war between China and US. China definitely will still view Australia as a very important trade partner. So in a way, it depends on how we play with it, how we balance our diplomatic and political needs and our economic needs. So that is in our hand how Canberra plays with that. And secondly, relies on the China's economic performance. As we know, China's economy has been slowing down a little bit in the past couple of years, but of course that's fair enough with a huge foundation. But if the global market, and especially from political and diplomatic perspective, China is facing lots of pressure that will eventually affect market sentiment and China's economy. And as we know, China is our major buyer of mining resources. 2/3 of our export of iron ore exported to China actually stay in China rather than be manufactured and re-exported to overseas markets. So our economy largely depends on, export largely depends on how China is performing within China, not just global market. And the third one, of course, the global market, how the global trade landscape is changing with the trade war, with especially the impact of how COVID-19 is impacting the global market, how the global community is responding to it, and how they view China's role in this, how they balance the needs. And if the global trade is not doing well, or there's also pressure for China, etc., and then that will definitely affect us as well. At least in the short to medium term, we won't quickly find another client as substantial as China for our agricultural products, for our iron ore. We should not forget that China, in a way, saved us from the global financial crisis. We were the only OECD country which did not go into recession thanks to China. So that is medium long term view. Currently short term, I think definitely both Australia and China are affected by COVID-19, not to a large extent. It's more due to the technical issues. For example, limited space, increasing air freight, sea freight, the slowing down of customer clearance procedures, the quarantine procedure takes much longer than before. So those technical issues are actually affecting the bilateral trade, but I don't think that is long-lasting. That will be back to normal when COVID-19 is over.
Okay, great. Look, maybe we'll just go around the group as well, just very quickly before we dive into some sort of specific issues. Just the shape of the Chinese recovery. I think everyone would like to hear a view on that. Professor Jia, do you have a view? We've talked about third quarter things normalizing, but do you want to expand on that? How you see the shape of the recovery in China?
Well, the the national government numbers have been praised for being trustworthy this time. You know, it's partly because of the pandemic. You have a good team of foreign observers who continue to stay on rather than traveling during the Spring Festival. So we had a sharp drop of growth in the first quarter, but by about 6 percentage points. But then the issue is, what are the priorities next? There is some debate about a reinvestment in infrastructure, and some want to call it a new set of infrastructure. But how new? Well, you have 5G and whatnot. 5G, Huawei, you know, these things, it boils down to pulling concrete and steel and do these transmission towers. So that's steel, iron and steel. But a lot of others are more cautious, that basically saying, if you look at the 6 new areas of priorities for government, they basically say, let's work on employment, and let's work on keeping the factories going, rather than pursuing a new target. But exactly how bad the employment situation is, that really is a big unknown, partly because of the lockdown, that very more seriously, you know, an individual's fear of getting infected. We don't have a lot of jobless people in the streets, but and that makes it difficult to account for this. And then Chinese consumers traditionally have a really fairly high percentage of personal savings that can tussle us through for a while. But I do believe after May, students are returning to school. Then after May, middle of May, the country is going to be back on normal. Let's say, if not 100%, probably 70%. And that's a time when things like what Sarah was just saying, that Chinese demand will probably pick up again.
Okay, that's probably a good point to jump into the sort of deleveraging debate. Geoff, do you think that the sort of COVID crisis will be an opportunity to embark on a sort of another ambitious stimulus program, or will the process of deleveraging in China continue, and they'll focus on more sort of micro things like employment and you know, keeping households liquid and things?
Yeah, I think they're going to continue with deleveraging. Debt's over 300% of GDP now. They've stuck with that policy for about a year or more, 18 months, trying to fix up the balance sheet a bit. I think, though, there's plenty of room for fiscal stimulus. And much of the discussion that I've seen centers around fiscal stimulus. Professor Jha has just mentioned infrastructure spend. So I think, particularly from the central government, there is a big capacity there. But I think also just confidence is going to be extremely important. If the government comes out and says the right things, and if COVID-19 disappears quickly, then if there's a surge in confidence, I think consumer demand will sustain growth as well.
Hans, I know you've done a bit of a survey of some businesses and things like that. What does that tell you about the shape of any Chinese recovery and how it might impact on Australia?
Well, we have a bigger survey coming out on investment with one of the major global accounting firms, but we've done a bit of private asking around among Chinese entrepreneurs here in Australia, a few dozen people, simply what they think. And I think one point that was very clear, where we did a Likert scale, where we had a very, very strong response, was the confidence in a fast recovery in China. In fact, they basically all agreed the recovery in China is going to be faster and stronger than the way they see the Australian recovery. And these are people from Chinese enterprises and entrepreneurs here in Australia. They also saw that they will change the way they run their business. They will rely more on IT, communication and IT structures in general, and they will have to look at their supply chains, inbound, outbound. So they see that as a big change coming their way. students coming back, we asked that as well, what they think, and people were guarded on that. So they were basically even saying, well, maybe, maybe not, but nobody really wanted to commit strongly to saying that this is likely to happen very soon and likely to happen this year. On trade volume, they think trade will recover, but whether it will reach the level that we had a few years back or until recently is not quite clear. Also, they're not sure, now these are private opinions, whether Chinese investment into Australia is going to increase. But that possibly reflects the whole connectivity and political climate.
Yeah, very good. Sarah, do you want to jump in there as well? I mean, are you getting a sense from your members, people you talk to in the business community about the strength of the Chinese recovery? Do you feel that confidence that Hans mentioned?
Me? Okay. Yeah. I actually recently communicate a lot with businesses both in China and Australia. Businesses in general feel confident for the medium to long term demand from China. So the business activities probably have started slowing down a little bit, but they're preparing. And I also talk to Chinese businesses on a daily basis. I feel the market sentiment, it's a mixed picture. It depends on the who I'm talking to. State-owned businesses are much more confident. Well, SMEs are facing some challenges. But also I look at some data in China, it's not that bad actually. The unemployment rate was only 5.9 in March, which is 0.3% drop from February. And also depends on sectors, like for example, in the restaurant sector, close to 80% restaurants are back to work. But of course, there's potential risk of second wave of COVID coming back. Anyway, the market sentiment is a mixed picture, but the whole economic performance in March is much better than what Chinese government and also the market predicted. So in that case, that kind of saves people's confidence to some degree.
Okay.
So this is what I heard. Yeah.
Okay. I guess that takes us to the idea of a sort of a decoupling of China and the West. The common view is that the West might decouple from China. I guess there's another view, and Geoff, you've expressed this pretty strongly in the past. What about if China were to decouple from us, deliberately sort of move away from the Western system? Do you think that might be a natural consequence of what we've seen in this crisis?
The way you put the question, Angus, no, I don't think that's a natural consequence, the emphasis being on the word natural. In fact, the world's coupled for a very good reason, and that is it's been highly economically efficient, and any decoupling will come with great cost to the coupled and the decoupled parts of the world. But I do say that China will look again at its relations with the West, and particularly the United States, and it may move to a situation where, through its own standards, it starts to decouple from the West. A parallel internet service is already being mooted. Huawei is dominating 5G around the world. That could continue, could go into 6G, and the standards could well be set by China. I think this is actually a very big worry for the West, that China has reached a scale and weight that these sorts of things are now possible. Whether China pursues it depends on what its global strategy is and also the cost ultimately. But I really take issue with the discussion when it's couched in terms that it's the West's sole prerogative to couple or not to.
What would be the consequence for someone like Australia if China was to do a forced decoupling?
Well, I've just mentioned iron ore earlier, and you could see that there is potential globally for China to diversify sources of supply in raw materials and energy. It would certainly damage the student trade because there would be disincentives for parents in China to send kids to Australia, and so it goes. So it just depends how far China, Beijing rather, and the Communist Party want to push it. But these should be recognised as real possibilities these days, with real costs to Australia.
Talking about the supply chain, Professor Jia, you have had a bit of a look at some of the hysteria around, I guess, production of pharmaceuticals and this sort of idea that the West is too reliant on China and India. Do you want to talk to, I know you've had a bit of a look at this, and maybe that's a nice way to look at the pharmaceutical industry and then talk about how you see that coming into affecting supply chains.
Well, I've just put this on the screen. This is probably thus far the most reliable number I've found. On the right-hand side, you have where it comes from, the website. It's fairly recent. And it's put in percentage terms, the pie chart, right? But you have to read the fine print. It's the percentage of active pharmaceutical ingredients. That's basically the raw, the component going into a final pill or a final fluid injected into your body. The API facilities for all drugs by country or region. So we're counting facilities. We're not counting tonnage. We're not counting the final product, right? So China 13%, India 18%, altogether 31%. That's higher by 3 percentage points than the United States. All right, but don't forget, China and India each has huge domestic populations to consume all that. So that's useful to put in perspective. But before I forget, I thought Australia had a tremendous role to play here in terms of working against decoupling. More specifically, I thought Australia ought to be taking the lead in working with the WTO to suggest, to recommend travel vaccines for adults who do international travel. This is a part of the portfolio of the WHO's work, World Health Organization. Australia, together with Japan, has been the two leading members of the Western Pacific region of the WHO, beginning with 1952. So given the shape of the situation between China and the United States, and frankly speaking, some European countries have not been very forthcoming. You've got a deal of nationalism therein. If we really don't want to see the forced decoupling or politically or ego-driven decoupling, we need to get the business people to be traveling again. We need to get the students to be traveling again. And those individuals need to have some confidence that they are being certified, quote unquote, as being safe, or they have a precautionary treatment. That's the travel vaccine. As I see it, if Australia comes out, especially if you link with Japan, there is work to do. Or we can start out with the Western Pacific region. Somebody has to do that. Now, I don't really think China is going to proactively de-link from the rest of the world. Fear goes different ways. And one way, this is I'm going to say one thing, but very quickly, about how we've been handling the relationship with the United States. During the COVID, we repeatedly, and even including myself, we work with government officials to ensure that Americans are assured that China is living up to its end of the bargain of the so-called Phase 1 deal. We have not protested, for example, Trump's keeping tariffs on Chinese imports from China while waiving tariffs on imports from elsewhere. And neither has Peter Navarro denied made in China masks for Americans to use. If anything, we're talking about thousands of tons of made in China products going to the United States. So fear goes both ways, but in this particular situation, Australia has a very important role to play in reassuring China that it's not going to cut off, going to adversely affect the Chinese access to foreign-made medicine. And during the COVID, we looked at how Iran is being treated by the United States. Very terrible. Years after years of sanctions, denial of basic medicine, right? And Australia is quite a leader in this. I mean, you don't have to do anything extra. Just don't, proactively say you're going to yank it apart. And earlier, Hans talked about students. And another area of connectivity really is to work under APAC, if not, or through Southeast Asia, here on the standards and the regulatory regimes and the mutual recognition of products. You may not have them everything produced in China or another country, but in times of need, you want to be able to have products certified very quickly. You want to have a chart to reference so that rather than what's going on now, a lot of these products that keep staying in warehouses in China rather than going to the hands of patients around the world because Chinese standards, and including such details as Chinese language put on the use of the masks or ventilators are not easily understandable. This should be prevented. We can, it's a service, and Australia can be a leader in working on these kind of connectivities. You have Southeast Asians, you have Japan, and a little bit of Washington. You know, the Americans are sometimes funny. They have a lot of things to say, but in the end, if you have done the homework for them, like I said, Peter Navarro has not told the Americans, say, anybody's mask, but made in China masks. we can have a contribution to make.
Okay, very good. Hans, what do you think about the sort of decoupling issue, and particularly as it pertains to investment? Do you think we might see something of a Chinese investment strike in Australia, given the move to very quickly lower the threshold to Chinese investment to zero and point the finger at Beijing as a reason for doing that?
Let me take that in two steps. And the first step is really to look at the economic rationale for decoupling. And it is actually not something that affects Australia in the same way that it does the United States or other countries, because decoupling was originally for trade. Trade, of course, Australia has major benefits from dealing with China. Our trade surplus comes from China in the end. Decoupling moving to technology is not our business, because we're not in the technology markets. We are buyers, but we are not providers. So we are a market, and essentially we will have to take where we go. It's quite different for Europe, but even Europe will not really want to decouple with China because they share markets in Africa and other places. Another point with decoupling is that it's very easily confounded with deglobalization, and deglobalization is very simply seen as something where we move away from deglobalization. Is not right and is not the way it works. What deglobalization in fact means is a decentralization of global production. That is, production is moving closer to consumers because of technological change. That's driven by Europe primarily, that's been followed up by China, and that is going to change the way in which trade operates, in which good flows globally in the longer term. So that's a trend that was even there before the decoupling, and that will be reinforced by the whole COVID pandemic, but it is a solid trend that will go on. The point with investment, I think what the Treasurer did to stop that temporarily, perfectly reasonable. You don't know where markets are going. You don't know where companies are going. Fortunes of companies can change from day to day. So you don't want necessarily to have investors or speculators moving in there. But it's something that Europe has done as well. So it's not something where we are special. And to present that as an anti-China measure is part of a political rationale, but not a business rationale. Because I think in the end, if we come back to a post-COVID situation, we will have to look at the way we work with China, and probably with all these trends, there will be more demand. For example, if we build a high-speed railway, would solve some of the airline problems.
The long dreamed of high-speed railway, yes, indeed. Well, we won't hold our breath for that. Maybe in 2036 we might actually complete a scoping study or something. Sarah, what about what are your members? What are you hearing from the business community around investment and the appetite to perhaps invest in Australia? Do you think there has been a step change, maybe driven by some of the anti-Chinese sentiment coming out of Canberra?
Definitely. I think the activity wise, we definitely see slowdown, not just recently, but in the past 24 months. And it's more about the market sentiment, people's confidence, where the bilateral relationship is going. And there has been up and downs. But also, I think sometimes is the exaggeration of China's investment in Australia. China is only our fifth and number five biggest investor, rather than number one or two. But the way, I don't know why the China is just easily be picked up. Maybe because people are concerned who is investing behind that. But anyway, so definitely that bilateral relationships plays quite big impact, very important role on the Chinese investment into Australia.
Okay, look, we might, we've got about 20 minutes to go. We might take a few questions from the floor, which have sort of come in from those who have registered. Just quickly, maybe around the traps, Geoff, I might start with you. Firstly, do you think post-COVID-19, are we going to be more or less economically dependent on China?
We're putting questions of decoupling, deglobalization on one side. All other things equal, we will be at least as dependent as we are, and we will continue to be dependent. I mean, the reality is, as long as China keeps growing, investing in infrastructure, incomes are rising, Australia is a competitive source of supply of those products, and it will continue. And the relationship will continue to be asymmetrical, with Australia far more dependent economically on China than vice versa, obviously.
Do you think the political relationship, however, and the deterioration in the bilateral relationship could start to have an impact on the trade relationship, Geoff?
Look, 2 years ago, I would have thought it probably would have, but we've been through 2 years, as I said earlier, of vicissitudes in the relationship, and trades continue to grow strongly. It does reflect, I think, just the basic depth of the comparative advantage that exists between Australia and China. And that's why, India or other countries will not replace China as our major economic interest, because none has the size and the pronounced comparative advantage that we have and China has with us.
So you think that even though we are at a historical low in the bilateral relationship, we can ride it out, the trade relationship can ride it out. In fact, indeed, maybe the economic and the political relationship has decoupled?
Well, yes. To that extent, that seems what's happened over the last 2 years. There's been some things on the edges. There's been some issues with coal, with wine, a few other products, but the volume of trade is massive and continues to grow in very large steps.
Okay, we've had a few questions on xenophobia. Professor Jia, do you get a sense of China's place in the world, or China viewing its place in the world has changed post-COVID-19? Do you feel that China will come out of this crisis more emboldened as a global power, or do you think there'll be the sort of international pushback will maybe see China take a more conservative position in terms of foreign policy?
What I'm going to say is strictly my personal opinion and may sound offensive to some of my colleagues here in China. But look, what we call propaganda element of our government, or what sometimes you nicely put it, soft power projection efforts, they overplayed their hands by saying that there was a China model to follow in dealing with the pandemic. What often got unnoticed overseas was that there was indeed a project launched, I think, by one of these major news outlets, 大国抗议, a big power leading the fight. And it was very quietly but powerfully suppressed by the central leadership. So a lot of times, the rhetoric by people who run newspapers, like I mentioned earlier on, this chamber effect, echo chamber effect in media, gets to be represented as the only Chinese voice. That's not true. A lot of Chinese feel quite thankful, for example, to countries throughout Southeast Asia, India, not so much India, Australia, Japan. At an early stage, you donated products, you went through your warehouses to clear out the stock and send to China. And come a time, again, this was totally unexpected that somehow this was going to spread, become such a global phenomenon, and the Chinese would, be able to donate or supply back. That's very basic reciprocity, like between. So to elevate this into a development model, into ideology, this is really too much. And I don't think that represents the main thrust of China, point one. Now, point two, post-COVID, let's hope this gets over. I would think China will have to accept the reality that what Hans and Geoff and Sarah were saying, that a lot more governments, a lot more businesses will come to take a second look at the supply chain, and they want to put essential products or components at least closer to consumption. And that's very understandable. And that's a way of actually, in the longer term, deflating much of the criticism that China receives for being the center of global production. I was just discussing with Hans in preparing for this today. Some 30% of our economy, Chinese economic activities, is manufacturing related. This is a huge amount of work. For some of this to leave China and go back, including to Mexico, that's closer to the United States, it's quite understandable, and it's in the interest of everyone. We don't have to be, we're going through shocks, but we need to find a way to live with, tempering the.
What about Chinese foreign policy? How do you see that changing or recalibrating post the virus?
I think we will continue to, frankly speaking, focus on the neighborhood. That's Asia Pacific. And the Belt and Road will continue, probably not in the kind of scale going back. There is a bit of a reset with the United States. Hopefully, the Americans are going to take the execution of the Phase 1 deal as a closure of sorts with China, but we'll wait and see. It's an election year. But going back to the Australia topic, I would think that's one reason I come to this forum. I think it's too sad that Australians only talk about Chinese investments into Australia. I never really hear about you folks thinking about Australian investments in China. If nothing else, you invest in China. It's a more direct way of getting a feel about the changes in the Chinese market, right? It does not always have to be iron ore. You can find your niches. There is one country that is the single largest source of investment by country in China. What's that? Singapore. Does Singapore have iron ore? How did the Singaporeans manage to have that? I think it's I would encourage more and more Australians to think that one way to balance the relationship is to be more proactive, far more proactive, or including teaming up with Singaporeans and Southeast Asians and test out the Chinese market rather than doing what's being done in Canberra, at least. You stomp your feet, it's just the Chinese, the freaking Chinese, the Chinese. What's the point, right? If others can get it done, why not you? And how better to know about an economy, to predict its future change by being on the ground, and that is to say, there's more investment into China.
I think that's been a long-held criticism of Australian business. Sarah, I'll come to you. We've had some questions around xenophobia and anti-Chinese sentiment in Australia and around the world. I think it was already building prior to the virus. How do you see it playing out now, and how do you think we counter that?
Yeah, I would say it requires a very humane approach for people to see this, not just from political and from economic or diplomatic perspective. And personally, as an Austrian Chinese, I could feel the pressure. And the Austrian Chinese community, I know, also faces pressure, how to deal with the situation and what role we should play. End of the day, Austrian Chinese and Australian, we're Australian, we're not Chinese anymore. No, but this kind of situation, anti-China or anti-Chinese or anti-Chinese overseas, actually, I think is dividing some countries and bringing the history back to 20, 30, or even 50, or last century. So, which is a pity, and I'm very sad to see that. But I really would like people to think this from a bigger picture. End of the day, what is our value system? What is the value that Australia respect? What's the value every single person and every country respect and every culture respect? And to see from that perspective and see how to treat this in a more objective way, in a more fair way. And then probably that can also give us a better idea how to look at our diplomatic issues, our economic issues, our trade relationships with China. And probably this applies to some other countries too.
Okay. Got some
if I may.
Yes, please. Jump in.
Actually, the knife of xenophobia cuts both ways. I'm quite impressed by reading a paper, Catherine Mason, who did a sociological study about the Medicare community here in China. You know, we suffered through SARS and whatnot. But come a time when America and Mexico went through its own pandemic, H1N1 2009, there was a popular belief here in China, oh, wait a minute, no, this is more related to the Caucasians and nothing to do with other Asians. So we ignored pretty much, you know, how to learn, to do the basic science, to say this has nothing to do with genetics or has nothing to do with this kind of, what you nicely put it, culture-based understanding of race. We lost an opportunity. I look at what's going on in terms of xenophobia, what Sarah and others describe in your societies, as saying the real loss is on the majority of the population. You may not be Asian, you may not be Chinese, however, that's defined. But in the end, you stick to those viewpoints. Like we are, frankly speaking, I think we are here in China, we're paying a price for thinking the H1N1 in Mexico and the US 2009, that was after SARS, was Caucasian, had nothing to do with Asians. And similarly, you should be avoiding that kind of mistake. And that's the real sad story, cost of the xenophobic sentiments.
Very good.
You lose an opportunity to learn, educate yourself, prepare yourself.
Exactly.
Scientifically.
Geoff, we've got a question for you here. What are the prospects of acting in concert with regional countries in questioning China's actions in order to avoid damage to our relations with our major trading partner, China? So I guess it's a question about, can we build a regional coalition to have an inquiry or look at the sort of origins of the virus?
Look, thanks, Angus. I think the issue of regional coalitions to raise the cost to China of bad behaviour is, I think, something that should be at the top of our diplomatic agenda. It doesn't target China per se, but China has to understand, with its great weight in the region, and all great powers behave badly from time to time, that for us as a foreign policy objective, that should be number one, to build these regional coalitions. And in the past, we've been very good at it. We developed a coalition to bring peace to Cambodia, which we initiated and led. We initiated and led the creation of APEC. The regional Bali conference on people smuggling, we initiated and led. And we can do these things and have done it before. That's where, in some ways, I'm so disappointed with the direction of Australian foreign policy. We seem to have lost confidence in ourselves and our ability to shape the regional environment through coalition building. It's a big job, but I do agree with the suggestion, and I wrote a paper on this for the Asia Society. I think 2018 was published. But yes, I mean, I fully agree, and I think we don't have many other options.
Do you think Australia lacks a bit of diplomatic heft these days? Do you think we've watered down our diplomatic efforts in running down the DFAT?
Absolutely. It's not just running down DFAT, Angus. That's very true. And the fact that China foreign policy is now run by the Security Intelligence Defense Department, are very closely aligned with the US military-industrial complex. But the inability of Australia to manage its relationship with China during this complex period of change in the global order means that we lack credibility. If you can't deal with China in our region, you can't really deal with anyone else. And the point was made by Professor Jha that Singapore manages its relationships with China very, very well. Yet it's still closely aligned, not an alliance, but closely aligned with the US in defence and security terms. The question that I think Canberra has to answer is, why do our neighbours, including New Zealand, to democracies, countries in the region, countries that depend absolutely on China for trade, why are they able to manage their relationships with China as they do, and we are unable to manage a relationship with China these days?
Hans, do you have a view on this? We've got some questions on the FDI for you, Hans, but I think you've answered those. What about this idea, and maybe this is a good point to finish, we've got about 5 minutes to go. There seems to be an overwhelming narrative that China is to blame for this crisis, that this virus originated in Wuhan and that it was, as Donald Trump said, a Chinese virus. This is coming from the questions here. Do you think that there is this preponderance to blame China? Do you think that's fair? And do you think that coming out of this, that this will affect the way that each country deals with China? This blame of China will be the overarching or will be another sort of thorn or a way that countries deal with China. I'll go to you, Sarah, first. Do you think basically, sorry, I know I didn't ask that very articulately, but do you think that this idea to blame China will continue, and do you think it will sort of poison, if you like, diplomatic relations?
Hans, would you like to answer first, or you want me to take this first?
Either one.
Okay. I think, at least at this stage, I think it's not smart to finger pointing anyone. For us, the number one, the most critical important role is to make sure our people are safe and our economy can be back to normal. And the next step, I think it is worth investigating what happened. And currently, we don't have enough proof, and nobody can tell the truth. And I think it's worth investigating, but any conclusions should be based on facts rather than based on any other agenda. And also, before we know the facts, I think we should stop finger pointing, because definitely it's affecting the relationship, it's dividing the country, it's dividing the people, and it's not making any good for anyone.
Hans, do you
Well,
think?
look,
I think the blaming of China came in a period where we had a massive, in the end, propaganda campaign against Chinese influence, which has been lasting for several years. And I think what it did was to undermine somehow the public support and the pragmatic and realistic view of China. So the coronavirus came in when there was already skepticism and very much promoted by the media. And so the outcome of this anti or sinophobic campaign really produced two outcomes. One was the general sinophobia, which we observe in society, and which is a worry. And not only in the most obvious cases where people get beaten up or so, but in subtle cases that Chinese experience when they looked at in an awkward way, and that impacts on them. And the other way in which it was manifested was clearly in the way we are blaming China for the coronavirus. There is no question. The coronavirus came out of China, but other diseases come out of other countries. So it's more a question of how to deal that rather than blaming it on a specific country. Another point which I thought I might make as well is that in fact Chinese official propaganda does not really help. Chinese official propaganda is made for domestic audiences. It doesn't work as well in Australia as it might work in provinces in China. That's something that I think the Chinese will have to think about, whether they can start to look at that in a more constructive way. And Professor Chang mentioned there's a whole range of reasons why, in fact, China could be much more relaxed, but the propaganda part is a weakness.
Professor Chang, do you see a preponderance to blame China for this? And does Chinese propaganda have a role to play in this?
You can blame China. You can blame anyone. Actually, if you look at the history of science on the origins of pandemics, you have people who keep writing papers, academic papers, that has said, each and every of these past pandemics originated in China, or it's Mexico, nobody else. So you have that bias, it's out there. It's not just politicians that recognize that first point. The second point is that more realistically, China could have, or anybody else, invited doctors from Australia, from America, from anywhere, want to come to Wuhan. Is that realistic? If you think about it, a doctor has to be able to talk to his patient. Language is the issue. When during the Sichuan earthquake, when we received these rescue teams, the local foreign affairs people, the first thing was to ensure that the rescuers were not going to get hurt. And they were struggling to find interpreters that could connect the rescuers with the local population. So we're talking about the limits of so-called transparency. So should there be a similar pandemic in, let's say, Sydney, and China says, you are not being transparent if you're not accepting 300 doctors from China en masse, because we need to be able there to operate on you, to collect the samples, to run the tests, so that this is credible. Would that work on you?
Sure, I get
that.
Geoff, I might give you the last
the last point, which is very serious. We are academics. This is not a China matter. The methodology of reporting a virus is problematic. If you look at the current rules of the World Health Regulation that tells countries, its members, how to report, what do they ask you to report? They ask you to report the DNA sequencing data. In other words, the belief is based on this, okay? Or so long as the members see the machine-produced DNA data, you know what's going on. You don't actually have to have access to the actual sample or the actual patient. And these are the kind of issues. Earlier, when I said Australia ought to be taking a leadership role, giving you a long history of involvement and leadership in the Western Pacific chapter of the WHO. Let's do something real. I would think, should we, as a community of nations, let's put it that way, you can never really write out China or India, these poor countries where you have wet markets, eating snakes or bats, whatnot. But I know I'm going to finish. But if we refuse to deal with this issue of the methodology of reporting, of learning about virus outbreaks, next time we're going to be at worse shape, worse.
Very good. Geoff, I might give you the last word. Do you think the preponderance to blame China will colour diplomatic relations between China and the rest of the world for the next 4 or 5 years?
Some countries, US, Australia, I think that will. And we need to work out how to get beyond that. Maybe some European countries, but I think more broadly, countries will understand the viruses rise in many different places at different times. And what will be recognized, I think, in the fullness of time with China is the capacity of the government to perform at an early stage to deal with the virus and to get the economy going again. I think many countries will say that performance capacity is very impressive.
For the moment, it would be probably quite ideal if there was a genuine effort from Canberra, behind the cameras, off the webinars, to relate to decision makers in China, say what's really going on. should this sort of thing, this drum beating be let down in the media, probably some folks here in Beijing saying there is something real. What is it? Because that some real conversation behind the scenes need to take place.
We shouldn't be grandstanding at this time and taking front position on calling for inquiries and task force to enter countries at will. What we should be doing is very careful coalition building with like-minded countries. But grandstanding at this time is going to be massively counterproductive.
Last question, Geoff, do you think we're out of step with other countries in how we've responded to this, or how we've pointed the finger at China?
Well, we're certainly in step with the United States. And that's another question. Are we aligned with the current administration or with the United States as an ally? But certainly our regional neighbours are not taking high-profile positions in the way we have started to do.
Very good. Look, we have run a little bit over time, but I think that was a very good discussion. Thank you, everyone who joined us. Olivier, if you have nothing more to say, or we might just sign off there, I think. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Angus. Thank you to the panel and everyone who joined us. That's great.